at Goldsmiths in London, where I run a PhD program called Advanced Practices, which is a transdisciplinary program which has at its heart the notion of curating or the curatorial as a kind of set of philosophical propositions, right? Um, this is something which I need to explain because in part of what I speak about, I'm not so concerned with the practicalities of curating, which are enormously important, and there's something you should all keep in mind. But really, what my interest is in, and that of some of my colleagues, is in how certain spaces are mobilized to produce forms of knowledge, right? So this is our kind of way of thinking about the curatorial. And sometimes that distinction between curating and the curatorial is quite useful to keep in mind that the curatorial is, in my usage and that of some others, reserved for this broader, expanded technical sense of curating, which is the sort of public production um, of knowledge, as it were. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is um, it's not too technical a talk, but I think it lays the ground or sets up some of the terms that I've been working with over the last couple of years, especially. Um, Curating and as justice, the demand of the forensics. So I'll spend a little bit of time trying to explain each of these terms as best as I can. Um, I'm taking this stroke between and as from the work of my colleague and collaborator Jean-Paul Martineau. We write together and work together often. And in his groundbreaking book, Curating as Ethics, he makes the case, which I've sort of rehearsed just before this, that curating should be understood as a kind of philosophical activity, as well as a sort of practical side, i.e., it can produce philosophical propositions um, or forms of understanding that are unique to it, right? Um, he also sort of early on in that book, Curating as Ethics, he makes this sort of sweeping survey of what curating is today, and he says, well, basically, curating is everywhere. It's such a diffuse and spread out activity. It's across so many sites and within so many systems that it no longer makes sense to speak of curating as a kind of uh, traditional endeavor or enterprise in which there are people who take care of objects in museums or galleries, which is the traditional sort of understanding of curating, right, related to care. Um, but in fact, curating is something that we see in tech companies. We see it on Spotify, your curated playlists. In fact, it's become in many ways a floating signifier, i.e., sometimes it means nothing. It just gives the impression of carrying some old meaning with it, right? For example, the pub at Heathrow Terminal 3 is called the Curators. Right, you wouldn't have thought this that a few years ago anyone would have thought this is a cool name, but it's called the Curators. Uh, there's a brand of crisps here in England. In fact, it's a brand of pork scratchings, which is as disgusting as it sounds, but it's called Curators Crisps. So really, these are things that you just see this word everywhere. Now, that could mean either that it's something that is now very trivial. We don't need to worry about it. It's just this thing that's passed into the into popular culture and really has no substance to analyze. Or it could mean that it's extremely important to think about seriously and in the expanded sense, i.e., what is taking place in a culture that is increasingly visual, but also increasingly curatorial. Now, within this framework, what I want to think about specifically today, and as a portion, it's a small portion of my wider project, which is called Curating and Justice. And my project, incidentally, is more focused on race and reparation, although that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. Uh, but this is a section which introduces the work of some of my colleagues, which you might be familiar with. But I'm going to try and sort of place it within the context of my arguments. So that part is the demand of the forensic. And we'll be talking about the forensic turn in art and curating. So many of you will know the work of forensic architecture, which is an investigating agency that works across the world in investigating genocides, human rights violations, incidents of injustice, and they mostly use, or they use, initially they started out using architectural modeling techniques to recreate events like explosions, government-sponsored drone strikes in the north of Pakistan, for example. And they would use their expertise to produce what they call counter forensics, right? And here, forensics refers not just to the legal argument side that we all know about, the forensic argument and so on and so forth, but also to its origins in the word forum, right? That there's a forum in which evidence is presented or an appeal to justice is made. Uh, Now, we call it the forensic turn because, in the wake of the work of people like A.R. Weizmann, um, starting since around 2005, we've seen a spate of works which are investigative, which are um, focused on producing a certain kind of justice, right? Not just nodding towards it, but in making justice somehow take place within the space of the gallery or the museum, right? Now, this is quite crucial to what I'm saying. So, stay with me here. I'll try and show some counterexamples as well. So, this shift, which we mostly see, I think, in international exhibitions, in biennials, in triennials, and all of these things, um, which bring together increasingly uh, people from various disciplines whose focus is less on traditional art historical concerns or on traditional art and aesthetic concerns, but more on this notion of the forensic or of investigation or of towards some kind of social justice, right? Um, so what has changed in these last few years? This is what I'm trying to sort of build a kind of narrative out of, and for reasons of space, it's a slight caricature of a narrative, but we can see that. And I'm going to use some very well-known images here, nothing too exciting or interesting, but just to sort of indicate the kind of shift that has taken place, right? So when Picasso paints Guernica in 1937 in response to the to the bombings in the city of that name, uh, this becomes this becomes and it remains today a kind of emblem of art engaging with an atrocity, right? Something unjust has taken place, and an artist has attempted to portray it in some way that gestures towards redressal of some kind. But what that redressal is, we're not sure. But what we know is happening is that we are in front of a painting and we feel some sort of empathy which we might not have had before with the victims of this atrocity, and that is the scene, that is the stage, as it were, the curatorial stage within which some sort of circuit of justice is taking place. Right? We see something similar, of course, in the work of artists, and the many artists in the Pakistani and Indian context that we could talk about potentially. Zainul Abidin and his drawings of the Bengal famine. So something similar again is happening here, that the artist is an instrument of truth, right? That there is a truth perhaps which needs to transcend its ordinary documentation and enter into the realm of an aesthetic appreciation. And in that process, in the shift from documentation to aesthetic appreciation, there is something that we're not quite sure what it is, but there's something taking place, right? Which presumably brings one closer to some form of redressal or reparation. Um, but by the time of, and here's our lovely forensic architecture gang, most of them are my colleagues, goldsmiths. By the time that we're looking at this sort of work, right, which relies on architectural modeling, digital investigations, lots of work and documents and websites, what is really being encountered, is information, right? So something has shifted. What we are encountering a is a kind of mediated technological information. Um, and the forms that it most often takes within the museum, within the gallery, is that of the document or the report, right? So the report is something that takes place on the ground, someone who's been there, or someone who collects information, visual information, and develops a counter forensic argument. And what emerges from it, rather than an expression or a sort of style of painting or drawing, what emerges from it is a set of details which put together constitute a forensic argument. And the form that it takes, as I said, is that of the report or the document. So that there's a major shift that's taken place in the last 20 years or so in what we expect is going to be our encounter in a museum, right? Okay, so the question that, for me, if I sharpen this question, and Zermina, stop me when I'm going on. If I'm going on too long, I can go on for far too long. The question that I'm addressing is, how is justice in these situations spatialized rather than represented, right? And here represented, I mean represented. So if we look at the work of Zain al-Abidin, we look at the work of Nagori, or we look at the work of Picasso, in only that instance of the Guernica painting, and that too prompted most likely by his lover Dora Maar, then what is happening is that something of about an injustice is being represented, is being represented. Instead, I propose what people like forensic architecture, or the people working in research architecture, or people like Lawrence Abu Hamdan, what they are interested in is the spatialization of both that initial injustice and the form of justice that might redress it, that might address it, right? So I'm going to look at a few distinctions here. So, as I said, in traditional art, we represent, again, Zain al-Abidin, etc., we represent the scene of injustice. So that's the primary scene of the work. And the secondary scene, the curatorial scene, if you will, is that of the aesthetic appreciation. A work on a wall, we're standing in front of it, and there's something that takes place there, right? In social activist art, which is another related form of work that I'm not going to talk too much about here, but social activist art redresses injustice, right? So you have community work, or you have spaces hosting that representing the scene of injustice and redressal. So someone might actually work in a community, or they might go and work somewhere where something terrible is taking place. And what we see inside the museum or the gallery is the residue of that process, right? So that becomes that's the sort of spatialization of social activist art, and you can think of people like Tanya Bruguera, or to an extent the work of Pakistani artists as well, like Zara Malkani and Shahna Rajani, although I would say that their work also falls into some certain forensic categories as well. Um, then in the forensic turn, what's shifted is that it's a focus on investigating a past, present, or yet to take place event, right? This is quite important that the investigation itself is the primary encounter that we have. There's not a traditional aesthetic encounter. We encounter an investigation. And this investigation, which is this fascinating thing here of a yet to take place event, is something that they call incitatory research or investigation, i.e., it incites something rather than looks back towards something, right? So you examine a situation and you incite an event. Um, and this is a phrase that they take from the philosopher Brian Masumi. And the other important thing here is that uh, what really takes place in the forums of forensic art is that material itself speaks, right? And this is really crucial. What is speaking is materials themselves. So it might be, how does dust speak to us? How do buildings speak to us about what took place within them? And they are the primary witnesses. They are the ones that offer testimony to us. And the job of humans and technology is to translate what these objects are saying, right? So this is artistically, and then as a result, I think curatorially, uh, a startlingly new paradigm, right? How do we take this on the challenge of materials speaking to us? How do we take that on curatorially? Um, okay, I'm going to skip over a few of these things, the blocks of text, but roughly, I just want to say that for Matt Fuller and A.L. Weitzman in this breezy, shortish book, Investigative Aesthetics, they reclaim this term aesthetic, right? I've been using it to mean that encounter, traditional encounter with the work of art. But what they're saying is that aesthetics for them refers to the entire set of senses that are used to investigate or record the world, right? So this is an expanded notion of aesthetics, and they're saying aesthetic investigations have a double aim. They are at the same time investigations of the world and inquiries into the means of knowing it. So there's a sort of double side to it. How do we know the world? How do we know that this building was bombed, for example, by American drones in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa? Uh, well, we know it because, for example, images that we have from Google satellite cameras, etc., they show us that there's a certain scatter of concrete, which allows us to say with our knowledge that this is exactly where something would have touchdown, this kind of explosive, and this is what would have happened. And this is so the focus on knowing something there is through extending the technological realm of the aesthetic. But then the question of how we know it is also raised. For example, one of the things that forensic architecture people working in Pakistan came across was that a limitation for them in using aerial photographs, satellite photographs, was pixel size. So you could only zoom in to a certain point in a map to see where someone had a house or a village had been bombed. Um, what was limiting was the size of a pixel. And not by coincidence, and this is their suggestion, that it's not by coincidence that the way in which these bombs were developed and evolved was in a way that they evaded full photographic capture, right? So the people who were making these bombs were also very aware of the fact that they needed to work within those parameters, that this is how large the sort of breakages can be, that pixel size comes into play, so that they can't be actually accurately seen. So this is what this double side of it is, right? That we investigate the world, something that has taken place or will take place, and at the same time we are beginning to question or think about the means by which we know it. What I'm extending it to is to think about what does it mean to curate these activities, right? What does it mean to host them? Is there a forensic or investigative curating? Right. So this is a question that's quite open. I don't have an answer to this for you, but I'm hoping that in the sort of follow up to this, we can develop some notions of what it could be. This is, if you look at this, this is the website for forensic architecture. Those of you interested can go into it and examine in enormous detail each of these investigations that they've got going on. There are many of them. So in a sense, you could say, well, the website is the natural home, the natural curated home for a project like forensic architecture, right? Because it contains within it all the data, all the maps, all the activities that went into making up the various investigations that they've done. Uh, but that isn't sufficient, not for me, and certainly not for this group, which does in fact aim to spatialize their work in museums and galleries, but also in forums like the International Court of Justice and the UN. So there's a whole history of this that uh, certainly AL has looked at, but I'm also interested in from a different context, particularly through the work of the legal theorist and philosopher Cornelia Wisman. And if we look at what kind of space is a museum might present for an investigation, my claim is that it relates most closely to spaces of transitional justice and to tribunals that are set up in between regular spaces of law, right? So this is a picture, some of you might know it, of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the German Nazi, who was kidnapped from Argentina and brought to Israel and tried and subsequently executed in the House of the People, Jerusalem, in 1961. So what is interesting about this is that it's a recorded trial. It's through an entire set of mediations, multiple translators. You can see there's a theatricality to the way in which he is sort of placed in this bulletproof cage. Um, it's also not a real trial because, in fact, his kidnapping was not legal according to international law. He was in Argentina. So there was a sort of breaking of sovereignty agreements to bring him to be tried. And of course, this court had no real authority over Eichmann, right, in traditional terms. So it functions instead as a form of transitional justice, which sort of ruptures from the form of the law, from the form of how things are supposed to be done, to meet some other expectation of justice, right? Not the law entirely, but that of perhaps the people, or sort of a broader view of justice. But in doing so, it retains the form of legal procedures, right? And this is what is intriguing for me. You still have the courtroom, the trial. You still have people sitting on one side and the witnesses and testimony and so on and so forth. And you saw this happen. Well, it happens in many places. You can see it happen with the early days of the Taliban in Afghanistan and in Pakistan as well, offering speedy justice, which was one of their routes to popularity and power. But famously, in the 90s, at the end of the apartheid era, you had the Truth and Reconciliation Committees in South Africa. Right, the aim was that people who had committed horrendous crimes, and I mean sort of killing people indiscriminately and essentially sort of racist crimes over a number of years, were allowed to speak up, meet their victims, and provide some sort of disclosure and closure, right? So the idea of these courts in this case was not to sentence someone to death like Eichmann, uh, but in fact to offer some kind of amnesty, right? So the aim is to end conflict. It's about truth and reconciliation. And as I said in the last point here, it's not the law that must be satisfied, but the people in conflict themselves, right? So normally in a trial, the result doesn't have to satisfy the people sitting in the courtroom or the people who are invested in the case. The result has to satisfy the law, and that's what is the strength of the law. But in this case, the law doesn't have to be satisfied because the law doesn't actually apply. Only its form, only the spatialization comes into play. You saw this happen in the Gakaka courts in Rwanda in 1994 after one of the most horrible genocides in the war between the Hutu and the Tutsis, in which you had situations, including that of people that I've known, in which entire families killed their neighboring families. Half the members of one family vanished and were murdered in really brutal circumstances by neighbors of people who they knew very closely. A form of ethnic violence that always threatens to erupt in parts of the world, including ours. Uh, and but after this ended, if we can say that it ended, but after that first major genocide, the question was, how do people go back to living together? Because they have to live really right next to each other or work in the same places. So the Gakaka courts, which were these tiny tribunal courts, were set up, and there were 11,000 or so of them. And they tried to reach some form of reparation or reconciliation to the extent that it's possible in these situations, right? So it completely changes what we think of the law as being slow, patient, evidence is produced and challenged. But here the aim is to get it done very quickly. And once again, I'm thinking of the way in which speedy justice has been a constant promise of radical groups in places like Pakistan as well, right? That it's the speed of justice which seems to frustrate people in situations like these after a tremendous injustice. And speedy justice, which still retains the shape of the law without its content, um, uh, it seems to offer something very powerful and alleviative, right? But the problems with this framework historically, and this has been studied a lot, is that reconciliation as an aim overlooks continued structures of injustice. Then some forms of violence extend well beyond an initial event. And I'm thinking particularly of sexual violence, the cases that I have followed over the last couple of years with students of groups of women who were raped or became pregnant as a result of sexual violence. They were not satisfied by this form of speedy justice, right? Necessarily, because whatever redressal is offered to them, whatever reparation is offered to them, uh, fades into insignificance compared to the continued evidence that they have, the trauma that they will hold, or the responsibility that they continue to hold in the form of their children. Environmental violence, of course, is the same kind of action, right? A single violent event that leads to perhaps centuries or millennia of uh, trauma, which we've seen recently in the work of people like Olufemi Taiwo in America. That environmental violence tends to map onto previous sites of racial violence. So where people have been racialized, there also environmental violence is taking place today. Then these trials tend to emphasize the positions of victim and perpetrator, and then future reparations and restitution might be foreclosed by the ending of the tribunal. We've done our job. Now you're reconciled. Now you can make no more demands because like a court, it's closed off now, right? So it plays a symbolic role, which tends to, for all the good that it also does, transitional justice, it also tends to foreclose the possibility of any real meaningful justice in some situations. So I would argue, and I'm coming close to the end of this, I'm rushing now, that curating investigative or activist works produces similar problems to those produced by transitional courts, right? It's not clear where the site of justice taking place is, right? What is where is this investigation and its justice actually taking place, right? If you remember in classic discussions of justice, there's justice being seen to be done, justice taking place. There are all of these sort of categories of how it actually extends into space and time. And for me, one of the dangers is that an aesthetic appreciation of the display of investigative work can replace actual reparative, restorative, or redistributive work, right? That is, we tend to stand in front of the document or the report, and rather than engaging with it with any form of understanding, partially because we don't have much time in a museum, we just appreciate it as a sort of beautiful thing, right? So there's something happening, I think, potentially today, which we need to try and break away from, which is the fetishization of the report or the document in and of itself, right? Um, so that's precisely it. Can we use this word aesthetic like AL and Matt do in their book to refer to both of these situations, to both of these encounters, right? Standing in front of Guernica, standing in front of this display of information. They're both, to our eyes, it seems equally at home in a museum, right? They're both. We're now, of course, used to this. We expect this. Uh, but is it the same kind of thing at all? Is it the same kind of aesthetic encounter at all? And what unites them, right? And if there is something that unites them, is that possibly a dangerous thing as well? Well, I'm again going to skip over a bit of this, but what I wanted to suggest again was that part of what we have to do, or part of what is a challenge for curatorial thinking today, is to develop something like what Ariella Aisha calls the citizenry of photography, right? For Azulai, since the invention of photography, there is a kind of new citizenship, i.e., the citizenship or citizenry of people who are photographed, who take photographs, and who view photographs, right? That they are actually in a circuit of understanding or seeing things through each other's eyes, which to some extent bypasses state citizenship. This is important for her as someone who's grown up in a right wing Israeli household, right? And for her, encountering pictures of events in Palestine allows her to see something which tears her outside of her normal subjectivity and citizenship, right? She becomes a citizen of photography, as she calls it, in this book, The Civil Contract of Photography. And then in her more recent book, she talks about the civil imagination of photography, right? So, as citizens of photography, we can see through each other's eyes and see each other through acts of collective and individual imaginations as participants in an unequal world, right? So, it's not that we're just seeing each other, oh, I get you. What we're actually seeing is that the world that constitutes us as these citizens is deeply unequal for us. This is what is important for this citizenry for Ariella. Um, my question is there a curatorial counterpart to this citizenry, a citizenry comprised of people who can encounter data, reports, digital images, exhibitions in a way that exceeds the citizenship of the state? And one of the things that I would propose is that, as allergic as I am to international exhibitions in most cases, that the international exhibition has functioned in this way since its inception as a spearhead of globalization. Yes, we know that it brings globalization with it, but also as an incitement for new subjectivities. And I'm thinking here of the possibilities offered to forms of politics and queer subjectivities, for example, in Pakistan that were not that found a new circuit through this exhibitionary complex and international citizenry, as it were. The political question for me is, can we transform these subjectivities that come to light through these exhibitions into citizenries? I.e., the difference here is that in citizenry, we understand not just a communion and community with these other subjects, but we also understand that we share with them a world that is deeply, deeply, profoundly unequal and unjust, and that it is our duty as citizens of this, as citizens of photography, but here as citizens of investigation, perhaps, or citizens of the curatorial, to attempt to repair or redress some of those injustices. I've gone on far too long. I just want to Zarmina, have I gone well over?
No,
Am I okay?
perfect. We started
Okay.
a bit.
Okay, all right. Fine. So I'll take a breath then. But okay, so I just want to end with some propositions, and these are part of my work, which is largely uh, deals with philosophy. Uh, and unlike most critical legal scholars or philosophers of justice, my claim is that we do not or cannot know what justice is, right? So I tend to reject or bypass these frameworks of justice, like people like John Rawls and people in his wake. And instead, I suggest that we must start from an understanding of injustice. Then we cannot accomplish justice as a final sentence or decision like we do in a courtroom, right? The work of justice is long and distributed across space and time. Then there's no adequate form of justice that can apply to all situations. Instead, and this is what's crucial for me, instead, the exhibition or the curatorial situation calls for an adequate space and time of redressal, right? So there's something that doesn't exist. It's not that the problem is that this exhibition cannot bring about justice. Instead, what this exhibition is forcing us to confront is that we need to provide the space and time of redressal to this situation in a way that doesn't exist at the moment, right? It sort of summons or forces it into being. And we can think of places where transitional justice programs have failed largely as as being related to not thinking about summoning these spaces into being, right? As just seeing the task as ending with the end of the tribunal. We can think of this as well with various legal social movements, such as the lawyers' movement in Pakistan, that for all of the profound effect that it had on the political situation in Pakistan, and also to our country's relation to the law in general, the force of the law, that is. What it failed perhaps to do was to produce an adequate space or time of redressal. They failed to perhaps summon that into being. Um, and then finally, the human justice form of justice that we deal with is finite. Um, Exhibitions have the particular duty to, and it's a sort of finite justice that they deal with. Divine justice, which is absolute justice, which is a correct justice, is profoundly unjust. There's a story in the Quran, which is and whether you're a believer or not, it's an interesting story nonetheless in Surah Al-Kahf, which is the story of the person who takes Moses on a trip, and that person is generally associated with Khizr or Al Khidr. And the idea is that he does several things in the company of Moses, which seem to Moses to be absolutely irrational or even cruel. He kills a child, he tears down a wall, which kills other people, he sinks a ship, which a poor fisherman owns. Um, and at the end of this, when Moses asks him why he did all of these things, what Khizr explains is that uh, if this child had grown up, he would have done this. And if this fisherman had continued on this journey, this would have happened. So that is divine justice, which moves from the future. It knows absolutely what is going to happen, right? So divine justice, and I think this is what this story is showing us, that divine justice, the justice of God, is for us profoundly unjust. It's not something that we can partake in at all, right? So we have to think of other forms of justice, other forms of meeting it out, but also of thinking about it. Okay, so I want to end there. We said that we put up questions for discussion. We can come back to this later, but this is a question that I thought perhaps can stay in your mind. What is the role of fiction and imagination in investigative art and curating? And how would you curate stories, songs, and music as material witnesses, right? Because normally material is dust and concrete and steel. How would we curate these things as objects and as material? So I'm going to end there and yeah, move on to the next thing. Thank you.
Thank you.